If you watched my recent video about white balance and gray cards and how nothing is really what it seems, and you probably don't even need those here on the channel, you know that color can be a little bit complicated and yet not. Well, when you enter film, it gets even more so and also not, because if you've ever shot film, you kind of know that even though every film is a different color and its interpretation of what is correct is different, it kind of always looks good. Why is that? If you go into Lightroom or Capture One and you start running whatever presets you downloaded from the internet, oftentimes one will look great on one photo and absolutely horrible on another. Well, it's because it was actually balanced. It wasn't actually trying to be correct by the standards of a toxic Facebook group. I know you've all been there and had someone telling you you were an amateur, even though they probably barely take photos themselves, and that your color was all wrong. Well, don't tell that to film, because every film has a different color, and guess what? Everyone is kind of right. So hold that thought on color, because today's video, I'm going to show you my new favorite method to scan 35mm film. And even if you're not a film shooter, today's video is going to give you some valuable insights on how you edit and how you understand and relate to color, which is going to make your shadow hacking easier. Also, film is really interesting and it's really insightful. It's also really hard to reproduce on digital, which is why I spend hundreds of hours refining and developing my Filmist presets. And a lot of the tests and experiments that I come up with come from that. Now, my recent tool for scanning 35mm film also comes from trying to get real film color, not correct color based on what they say on the Facebook group, but the color that's representative of, say, Portra or Velvia, etc. So I'm always out shooting these films and I'm out experimenting and making film images, having them developed and having them scanned. And I have them scanned in lots of different ways. If I'm shooting large format, you've probably seen me using like an Epson 700 series or sending it off to have it drum scanned. But with the price of film these days, 35mm is a lot more accessible if you just want to experience the beauties of film. Here's the problem. When I send these off to a lab, you've probably noticed, if you've had film scanned, that one scanner does it one way. One's green, one's warm. And guess what? You shoot a roll of film because you want that film. You want the color of that film. You've probably even noticed lots of presets and people shooting with film, making videos about film. And yet what most of them don't even realize is the results that they're getting don't even look like the film. If we go to the Internet Archive and go to something like popular photography from the 90s, you'll find film ads, the glory days of film right here. Here's a Fuji Reala ad right here. Now, I will actually go to these old ads sometimes to get a perspective. Obviously, magazine print isn't the height of perfect color, but these companies were spending millions of dollars marketing films, and they were trying to represent in these ads what that film was supposed to be like. But contrary to what most of the internet believes, if we go into Lightroom with a digital file and try and develop a photo with a portrait look, it's really not as simple as just adding a warm cast and toning down our saturation a bit. I'll get criticized for uploading a photo that's a gold tone or a warm tone, and people are telling me that's not the correct color, your color's way off. And I'm like, wait a minute, hold on, what exactly is correct color? Because I see differently and you see differently, and every camera sees differently, and all the films certainly saw differently. So we choose the final look we want based on the vision here. Don't let people in Facebook groups that are just there to tear you down let you decide your style and where you're going. Not that we shouldn't listen to critical feedback or that we should think we're always the best and none of the feedback matters. But usually if you're in a group and somebody's just tearing something apart or telling you you're an amateur or you're all wrong, go look at their profile. You'll probably find out that they're not someone who should be giving you critical advice on your photos. See, I've been doing a lot of scans recently because for Filmist 2 and the True Film presets, I've really ratcheted up making these accurate. But here's what happens. A negative isn't that absolute. So when you send your film to get scanned, you're usually getting back essentially a Lightroom edit of that scan that oftentimes has no relationship to what that film was intended to look like by the manufacturer of that film. Even if it's been developed correctly with all the charts and followed the right chemicals and all that kind of stuff, the temperatures, which all can affect the color of your film, even if all that was done perfectly by the lab, just the scanner being used, the way it's being scanned, and how they correct it. Because guess what? Even when you took color film in the dark room, you had to use color filters in the enlarger. And while there may have been recommended standards to get the right color out of it, this is actually how color correction and white balance was done in the darkroom, was using these color filters. Here on the screen is one of my own scans of Portra 400. Now it's pretty warm, it's evening, and so we kind of have that warm Portra look, but this is real Portra 400, and you can see the grain and the scratches and all that goodness in it. Let's reset this though. Here's the actual raw image capture of that. One of the beauties of doing your own scans direct from the negative. Now, of course, every sensor photographs slightly differently and all this stuff, right? So there's slight variables, but we're getting a pretty raw scan. If I do a recommended white balance from the neutral area down here of the negative, you can see that now we kind of get rid of that film base tint. That film base tint, by the way, is different on every film base. Let's go into Photoshop with this file and just adjustments and invert. And you can see that while our color, yes, is more balanced, a lot of other things are way off. But stay with me here, because we are going to talk about my new favorite film scanning method, including the way to do it cheap with a TT Artisan's macro lens and start scanning your own 35mm film with whatever camera you use for about $200 and get really high quality scans. But let's come back to Lightroom and let's go to plugins and let's actually go to Negative Lab Pro. And you can see here in Negative Lab Pro, we actually get a lot better results. It's a very good conversion app for negatives to get the right conversion. And yet even within that, you have so many variables. You could turn white balance to none because we've white balanced the negative base, right? Well, this certainly doesn't look like Portra, so we could go neutral or we could go Kodak, and there's all these different settings we could select, all these different profiles we could use, and different ways we can mix this. Are you seeing the problem here? Are you seeing why it's actually really, really hard to know if your film scans are actually like the real film, and why I have to spend countless hours tweaking and adjusting and experimenting and testing under different conditions to get Filmus to actually look like the real film? Let's go to a roll of Ektar that I recently had scanned. I was down shooting the streets in Mexico City, very colorful, great for the reds of Ektar. There was this red bus, and well, let's just look at it. Here's the first scan that came back from the lab. Okay, it looks good, but is this Ektar? The reds seem a little orange. Let's then go. I said, okay, this scan's fine, but let's do a cool scan, right? So now we're a more expensive scanner, a more expensive scan, and I sent that scan and I got this back. All right, so now we have a different scan, which arguably feels a little more neutral. Now, it's worth noting when I send scans in, I'm very clear with the scan text. I want true to film. I don't want corrections. I want it to look like the film is supposed to look. To be honest, I think a lot of the scan techs haven't even studied films enough to know what the film is supposed to look like. And when I say that, I mean, what is the intended look of the film from Kodak, from Fuji, etc. Here's my scan taken from the setup that I'm talking about today, which we'll get to in a moment. This has colors that are a lot more neutral, and the reds, they feel like Ektar 100. Look at all three of these together and you'll see that every scan is different. When I'm creating a film look, I actually want to do these comparisons. Now, I make videos and I say, hey, don't stress too much about your color, get the look that works for you. So I'm not saying that you have to be completely paranoid when you develop a roll of film. If your look is good and it was your vision, then you're fine. In my case, I'm trying to get true to life color. And a lot of us, when we're shooting film because we want the real world organic feel of that color, not a Lightroom edited, warmed up, color corrected, added oranges variation of that coming from a scan tech. That brings me to something like this. Now, the snobs might say, oh no, if you're cool, you're going to use an Epson scanner, you're going to use a drum scanner, etc. Well, I have an Epson V700. I've done wet scanning of my 4x5 negatives, all that stuff. And it works. It's slow and it's a lot of work. Guess what? With this, I can get really good neutral scans, and this costs about $100. So this actually has a light built in that's clamping onto here, and then it has a barrel with all these different extension tubes that breaks off here. But essentially, this kit is this right here with a light and then a film holder that you can run through it to scan your negatives. And it works pretty brilliantly because it comes with a whole bunch of adapter rings to adjust it to whatever lens you're using. You are going to need, however, a macro lens to get close enough and do this right. Now, I don't do a ton of macro photography myself, so I just went and bought the TT Artisans 40mm 2.8 macro. Turns out that this TT Artisans macro lens, which is considered a great little macro lens for the price, but it's obviously not in the class of a macro lens for macro nerds that are spending thousands of dollars. But guess what? For scanning 35mm film, it works perfect. The 52mm thread size also means that you could hook it right up to the scanning kit just like this with the included tubes. You don't have any extra adapters to buy or anything. I will put links to both of the kits that I got in the comments below. Essentially a $100 macro lens and a $100 scanning kit with a film holder, a backlight, and a bunch of adapter tubes, and we pretty much just hook it up like this. I don't need an expensive copy stand. These can actually get very expensive. It's all here, right? I don't even need to tripod this. I can literally just set it on my desk like this and load a negative into it, feed it through, and take photos. Sure, you might need to experiment a little bit with the exposure settings to get the true exposure that you had on your negative, things like that. But with a little experimentation, you'll be taking raw photos here that you can then load into something like Lightroom and use something like Negative Lab Pro, or you can use other apps like Silverfast. There's other Lightroom plugins. Negative Lab Pro is very popular. It does work very well, and it also costs about $100, but there's a free trial version that you can play with. Scanners are expensive, and you probably already have the camera, so you're getting actually a very high quality imaging system by just buying a few accessories. But the real beauty of this is I'm getting completely raw scans of these negatives that I can go in and try to make sure that they're true to the color of that negative. So if you have old negatives you're dealing with, or you're shooting film today, why go through all of this when you can just have the lab scan it? Well, there's certainly nothing wrong with having a lab scan it. But what I've learned with lab scans a lot of times is you're at the mercy of the tech scanning it because you're really getting nothing raw from them. They're doing color corrections, and they're essentially basing their corrections on their own biases or what people expect a film to be. Now, it may look good and you may love it, and that's fine, because there really is no correct color. All films see color differently. All people see color differently. You do want to know why you're doing something. Don't just say it's good and have it all over the map. You want to be able to edit consistently. You want to have your color the way it is for a reason, just like you have the shadows the way they are for a reason to create that drama. The beauty of film is in its subtlety. So let's go in, for example, and look at this. Here's a nice portrait. This is the raw file. Let's put a Portra 160 on this. Okay, there's Portra 160. I've made 3 copies of this. The next one, we're going to put Portra 400 on, the classic Portra film. Now let's go to Portra 800. Now these are all the latest updates from all the different variables and tests and scans that I've made as I continue to make Filmist 2 more and more accurate. If we look at all these side by side, you can see that each one is a little bit different and all of them work. And this is the beauty of film. The viewer is probably not going to look at your photo and say, oh, that's Portra 400. Like people might look at a photo and say, oh, did you use this filter? Oh, is that HDR? One of the first things I'll say to photographers with lots of experience or little experience is we tend to over edit in digital. Ground yourself by using film presets and you will completely change how you edit, because you won't have these looks that are constantly way oversaturated. The sliders are way pushed to the right. Now, if you are a Filmist 2 user, you're going to see that all the 2.2s that I've done in here in this update, 400H, Ektar, all the Filmist Portras, and others throughout, including Ultra and more, A lot of these come directly from these new scans that I'm showing you today, where I'm doing these scan comparisons, doing these tests, and really trying to get that digital edit as true to the film as possible. Even if I go later and say, no, this is going to work better with a silver preset and a natural HDR, I go into Photoshop and I do some of my more advanced layering effects like Lumist and Alchemist and get a final image. By editing with film to begin with, which I almost always do now, I get this really solid grounding, and consistency becomes a lot easier in my edits. In terms of your scanning and this little setup here, if you have film to scan, I highly recommend this. It's not a super expensive accessory. You can use it, by the way, with different macro lenses, but if you don't have one, I'm actually pretty impressed with the sharpness and detail coming from the scans in this. Now, just in case someone's like, oh no, that cheap macro lens isn't good enough to get a good scan. On the left, we have my scan with this contraption and the TT Artisans, and on the right was a secondary scan I sent off for. This was a high-res scan done on a Nikon Cool Scan. And if we zoom into 1:1, don't take too much into account the processing differences here in terms of the color and even sharpness. We can change that. But if you look across here, even corner to corner, all the way across these images, if anything, the detail is better on my version of the scan, although that could just be the processing from Negative Lab Pro. But overall, when you look through here, you see a lot of subtlety, grain, detail, very film-like feel. You're really lacking nothing in this scan taken from the TT Artisans. If you're shooting medium and large format, you're probably doing drum scanning or wet scanning, or at least flatbed scanning on an Epson or something like that. But for those of us that just want to go out and shoot film, experiment with different films and things like that, 35 is already very expensive these days, and the others are completely crazy, like when you get into 4x5 and things like that. These days with film like at $20+ a roll, and then scanning, developing, all that, a single roll of film is going to cost you nearly as much as my complete Filmist pack. But you should still do it, because shooting film is magical, and it does really make you feel good. It helps you slow down. It makes you a better photographer, even though, yes, I know you're not going to be doing it for everything. But as much as I can when I go out for a session, I try to do some film shooting. And yeah, sometimes you can even go back to those old photo magazines and get some ideas of how that film was supposed to be shown. When I'm doing film tests, I don't just use my own tests. I actually go and look at other people shooting the film, different develop conditions, different lighting conditions. I study that film and find everything I can and all the comparisons, the YouTube videos that I can on a film to crunch that data together and get, in my case, a preset that's as calibrated as possible. That's why I'm always updating Filmist, because I'm always finding little nuances that make it more true to film. So that's my new favorite method to scan my 35mm film. It doesn't mean I won't use lab scans or have different scans done for comparison. It just seems to work really well, and I'll keep using it. You guys let me know what you think in the comments. And even if you're not an active film shooter, I hope what we talked about with color and how many subtleties and variables there can be, it doesn't always have to be cranking the slider all the way to the right. The nuance of color, just like the nuance of shadow and tone, is really fine. It's really subtle, and working with it in a subtle way is going to help you understand your photography at a completely new level. All right, you guys, hit that like, subscribe button. We'll see you in the next one. I hope to see you soon at one of my Shadow Hackers workshops, and go download some of my free presets if you want to experiment with some of these true films yourself and just play around with it and go shoot a roll of film. All right, guys, take care.